you.
All right, let's pray and we'll get going. Thank you, Lord, for a good morning. Thank you for life and breath. Thank you for forgiveness. Lord, as we head into a massive conclusion here at Matthew, Lord, and get to your victory, we've got some tough stuff to get through. And so help us to understand it. Help us to appreciate it. Help us to love you more. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, Matthew 27 and verse 26 is kind of where we left off. And Pilate, then he released Barabbas to them, but he had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. And we had just started with that at the end of last week. And so there's just a couple things that I want to get through about the scourging part, because along with the scourging and the cross is really some tough stuff. But if we don't have that, if we don't understand what he went through, it's harder to appreciate what he went through. It's harder to understand the depth of the sacrifice that was made, because some of it actually doesn't make any sense at all. And so I want to dig through that a little bit from a medical standpoint, from a tradition standpoint. There's just some things in here that I just think it's important. And it's interesting to me that Matthew actually, when he talks about Jesus going to the cross, he gets him there in the story, and then he just says, and Jesus was crucified, and then he leaves it. And then he goes on to talk about some other people, some other characters that are part of the story. But he doesn't get into the weeds. He doesn't get into the details of it. And I was trying to think about that this week, and I don't have any great conclusion to that, except I want to reiterate that Matthew's purpose in writing the book was two things. One was to proclaim Jesus to the Jews, right? To prove to them that he was God. And two, that Jesus is King. And so we have to leave and get to some of the other Gospels to get into more of the story. And we have to go back in history to find out what the Romans were actually up to. And so we're going to bounce around a little bit today. So let's do that. First of all, we talked about scourging last week. Flogging or scourging was legally acceptable. It was what they did, they being the Romans. When they were going to crucify somebody, you were going to get flogged first. Why do they do that? Because they want more humiliation. They want to bring someone to the edge of dying, but not over, okay? And so the whole point of crucifixion was to suffer. That was it. And this was the worst thing that the trained killers could think of. This was the worst way to die. And they would stretch it out as long as possible. And it wasn't uncommon for people that were crucified to be on the cross for many days. That is mind-boggling. And I don't know if it's just because we're a little softer now than they were back then. But it's mind-boggling to think that you could hang up on a vertical post for days. And if you were a perfectly healthy, strong individual, even when you started that process, how is it that you can handle that kind of pain for that amount of time? It's crazy. That being said, you didn't get on the cross healthy. You got on the cross almost dead, okay? And they were so good at this, they were so perfected in this, that they could take people to the edge and back off, okay? So let's go back to the scourging piece. So I want you to know that it was legal that they did it, except if you were a woman or a senator, or if you were a soldier. With the exception of desertion, you could not be flogged, okay? So, the process of the scourging or flogging is that you would be stripped naked. Why would you do that? For absolute humiliation, okay? This was a public event. And then your hands are tied up above your head, and so you're absolutely vulnerable with absolutely nothing to hide yourself from, right? And then one or two soldiers would start the whippings. And reading about it, if your job as a soldier is to inflict pain, and you have no emotional regard for the person that you're hurting, what happens? What have we seen in history? That people can do some very, very terrible things to other people, right? And at the same time, they had done this enough that they knew exactly what they were doing. And so they didn't just tickle them, okay? The purpose was violence. And when the metal balls that are on the end of that whip hit you, it was bruising, okay? I was thinking about it this morning, like, it would be like buckshot with marbles. So it wouldn't go through you, it would just smash you. And so when you started that whole process as you were being whipped, the balls would smash into your skin and cause deep bruises, and the little bones that are tied to it would grab a hold of your skin. And then they would rip it back, just like they ripped it in, they would rip it back out. It's terrible. But that wasn't that they would just create one layer, but there would be multiple layers. And so as the cuts were cut into cuts, you start ripping into muscle, not just skin. What happens when you do that? You start to bleed, right? And so you go into physical shock, you're bleeding, and your skin is so much a disaster that you can start to understand when the Bible says that he was unrecognizable. Do you get that? Okay. There was no limit to the number of stripes that you could take. Way back when we talked about that the Jewish tradition would be 40 minus 1, right? And if it was more than 39, that would be considered humane. The judgment of the number of hits was based on the experience of the person doing the beating. And again, their point was to take you to the edge. All right? So Jesus is at the Praetorium. We talked about that last week. And he is severely whipped. You can go and look at 1 Peter 2:24, and it talks about it a little bit. But the interesting part there is that there is if you go back and look at the Greek, the word that is in there means that the scourging was particularly harsh, okay? And so if you have something that's done already in tradition, and they did his worst, okay? Just so we can catch that. All right. And the word that's used in there is called molops. And molops means a bruise or a wound with blood trickling down. And so the blood that Christ sacrificed for us started with the scourging, not the cross, okay? And in fact, I don't want to jump ahead, but when you get to the cross, you don't die of blood loss, okay? That they were very, very good at what they did. And so we'll talk about that in a little bit. So let's go to verse 27. Then the governor's soldiers took Jesus into the Praetorium and gathered the whole company of soldiers around him. They stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him and then twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on his head. They put a staff in his right hand, and then they knelt in front of him and they mocked him. "Hail, King of the Jews," they said. They spit on him and took the staff and struck him on the head again and again. And after they had mocked him, they took off the robe and put his own clothes on him. And then they led him away to crucify him. The Roman soldiers are amused because they have weakened this guy who said he was a king, right? And so they began mocking him. And we talked about this, I think last week, that this robe that they put on him, this scarlet robe, was a faded out robe from a king or a royalty person, okay? So when they put that on him, that was, again, mocking him as being this fake king, okay? And then they put this wooden scepter in his hand, or a staff, or a rod, or a reed, and then they start to spit on him. And we've talked about this before as well, but if you spit on someone, that is the highest form of disregard or disrespect, right? Okay? And that's why they did it. That was their mentality. That's what they thought of Jesus Christ. If you think about the scourging or the flogging, and they put this robe on him temporarily to make fun of him, what happens with that blood that is going down his back from all of the cuts all over his body? What happens to this robe? It sticks to it, right? And so then they're done making fun of him, and what do? They rip the robe back off. What do you think that looked like? Was it try on a new suit, and you put your hands out, and it's all fun and games? Your flesh, the scabs, it all is ripped back open again. Because of what has happened to him physically right now, he is in pre-shock, right? Physically, if you think about it from a medical standpoint, he is not in good shape here. It just, if you read through it, it just seems like there's no way that Jesus is strong in this moment. Like that physically he is strong, and he hasn't even made it to the cross yet. Okay, but there's a few things that we're gonna kind of go back and forth like a teeter-totter. I'm gonna sound like a politician because I want you to think about a couple things as we go through here. The thing that popped up in my head was, if you think back to Luke 22:43, it says, an angel from heaven appeared to him and strengthened him. When did that happen? In the garden, right before he was arrested, right? Okay. So then there's that, right? An angel from heaven shows up and strengthens him. What does that mean? I don't know. Was it emotional? Was it physical? It seems like, this is just my theology, that kind of does it have to be both? Both seems like it should be, all right? And so Jesus is getting carried with this strength that he was given. And then think about this. When we think about Jesus just as a physical person, as a man at that time, did Jesus sit around on his throne and do nothing? What did he do? He did ministry, and how did he do it? In a limousine? No. What did he do? How many miles? Many miles, continuously. We've looked at enough maps of the area of Galilee, and you think about walking around that lake and up and down the hills that we've seen in pictures. He was in good shape, right? He was in probably great shape. And then there's this. Jesus was God, right? Did that make him perfect? Yes. Okay. And what would that mean for him physically? Did Jesus have any diseases? Nope. Did he have ailments? Nope. Did he have bad joints, bad knees, arthritis, a torn tendon, a bad muscle ache? Did he feel things? Yes. The point of this is that Jesus would have been physically perfect. Now, I'm not saying he was the most beautiful person that ever walked the earth, but physiology of Jesus Christ was squared away. Okay? And so you have a perfect human specimen that is being punished here. I just want us to set that mindset, because I get highly annoyed when people say that Christ was a wuss. Right? The farthest thing from it. Right? Did that make him a bodybuilder? No. Did that make him a strongman lifter? No. But his physicality was perfect. Okay? And that's where he starts from as we go down this path of torture. Okay? All right. And then we go to John 19:5. John 19:5 says, when Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, Pilate said to them, here's the man, or here's your king. Okay? How's Pilate's relationship with the Jews? Fragile. Right? Does he love them? No, he's the governor over them. And he's being a politician, so he has to do things to not make their relationship worse once in a while. And then it seems like when he gets tired of it, what does he do? Gives them a whack, just to remind them that he's the governor and they're not. Okay? And so he brings out Christ in front of them and said, here's your king. Okay? Remember, we talked about quite a bit. What does Pilate want out of this? What does he want to do with Jesus?
Set him free.
Why does he want him to set him free? Because as a judge, he knows that Jesus is innocent. It's very important that we lock that down. Okay? All right. Pilate wants to release Jesus. Let's go to Isaiah 53. We're going to bounce back and forth here a few times, but we'll go to Isaiah 53, and I want to read verse 6. Specifically the second half. But we all like sheep have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way. Here's the part. And the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. Okay, we're in Sunday school. What does iniquity mean? Sin. Okay? All right. And then, real quick, look at verse 12 as long as you're there. Therefore, I will give him a portion among the great, and he will divide the spoils with the strong. And this is the important part. Because he poured out his life unto death, and was numbered with the transgressors. He bore the sin of many, and made intercession for the transgressors. Okay. He was numbered with the transgressors. A couple of ways to think about that. Number one, who hung on the cross with him? The transgressors. Okay. Who else are the transgressors? Me. Okay. All right. God the Father laid on his Son all of our sin. Okay. We need to, theologically, we need to get our head wrapped around this, and the more you dig into this, the more confusing your brain's going to get, okay? God had to lay sin on his perfect Son who was God. What does that mean? All right, hang on to that thought. Keep going. Go back to verse 27, and I just want to touch on this. The Pilate soldiers. Pilate's soldiers were probably from Syria. They maybe didn't even know who Jesus was. And it says as well, the whole company or cohort of soldiers. That's probably between 400 and 600 men. And so when the scene kind of changes from when Pilate sends him away to get flogged, and the whole company of soldiers goes with him, if you are one person and you are naked, tied to a stump, and there's 400 to 600 soldiers around you, what's that feel like? You have no way out, right? Mm-hmm. You're as vulnerable as you could be. And what happens when you have 400 to 600 soldiers who are trained to kill people, who are trained to torture people, and you have one person to put all your attention on? Do you get this? Is this sinking in? This is terrible. Okay? All right. 28, it says that they twisted the crown of thorns and set it on his head. They stripped him for public humiliation, and they put the faded robe on him to mock him. And then they pushed this homemade thorn down on his head. Why did they make this wreath, this thorn crown? Why did they do that? Because they were making fun of him as being a king, and in your own mind, in their mind, who was their king at that time? Who was their god? Caesar. And did Caesar have anything on his head that looks something similar to that? But I guarantee you it didn't have any thorns in it. Okay? And so, again, the humiliation just keeps going on and on and on. And then after kneeling and fake worshiping Jesus, they spit on him. Why not? Verse 30, they take this rod or this reed and they smash him on the head again and again and again. Anybody ever been smacked on the head? Hit with a log, hit with a strap, hit with a buckle. You know, we do dumb things as guys. We get hit in the head sometimes. Once was enough, right? And this isn't even close, but if you get knocked in the head with something that kind of sharp, not sharp enough to like cut your head wide open, but you have that particular pain, and so sometimes I'll just be like, oh, and you rub your head, because I don't know why, it somehow erases some of that. Over and over and over and over, he's getting smashed on the head, okay? All right. All of this mockery and wickedness, evil poured on Jesus, the God-man, and he put up with it. He didn't stop it. Could he have? Yeah, it could have been over in a blink of an eye, but he didn't, because he was on a mission. What was his mission? To save you, right? Okay. Again, Pilate is trying to appease the crowd. He doesn't want to kill Jesus. And we talked about they rip the robes off and the scabs are coming off. Any of the blood that has started to thicken is sticking to the robe, and it's ripped open again. And then we come to verse 32. And they were going, as they were going out, they met a man from Cyrene named Simon, and they forced him to carry the cross. Just for context, you see in the bottom left where Cyrene was. Okay? Easily could have, I shouldn't say easily, I'm not going walking miles and miles and miles, but they could have traveled, and here's your distance, okay? So, one of those, 500 miles, 600 miles away, could have come by boat, could have walked it. Why is this guy from Cyrene there? Why is he in town?
Passover.
Because of the Passover, okay? So, crucifixions were always done outside the city gate and along a busy road. Rome would crucify at least 30,000 Jews during this time period, and it was used as a billboard, okay? It was used as an advertisement. Don't mess with Rome. We are the conqueror. You are the conquered. If you want to mess with us, this is what happens. Do you think that you would remember what a crucifixion actually looked like if you walked by it? If you heard it? If you saw it? Do you think that would just leave your mind the next day? Fear does a lot to form how people behave. Okay? All right. Back to Cyrene. So, Cyrene's in North Libya. The guy's name is Simon, a Jewish name. And so, even in Acts 2, you can see where Cyrene pops up again. So he's probably in Jerusalem for the Passover, and he's picked out of the crowd. Anybody been in a room and somebody pointed you and picked you out of the crowd? I know somebody that loves that. Don't pick me, don't pick me, don't pick me. It's a tough question in class, and everybody does what? I'm not here. I don't know what you're looking at. I'm not really here. Simon gets picked out of the crowd. Did he ask to volunteer? No. Was he happy about it? Probably not one single bit. Because of what? Because now he's being humiliated for something he had nothing to do with it. And now the whole crowd, Passover is packed. Jerusalem is packed during this time. Many, many hundreds, thousands of people are going to watch him carry a cross, and he's an innocent man. Who else is innocent? Jesus. Okay? Nobody wants this job, but he got picked out. And then where do they go to? They go to this place. I believe this is it. There's two places historically. I don't want to tell you the wrong thing. I think this is called Gordon's Calvary. So this is the second place. This one makes the most sense to me. Okay? This is so fascinating to me. All right, let me help you see what's going on here. Do you see this hole right here? And then picture this. If this is a kind of a forehead right here, and then you have an eyeball, right? And right here kind of comes out a little bit like a nose. You start to picture in your mind a face. Okay? So then let me back you up in time and back up from this ledge. And look at this. This picture that I showed you before is coming across here. What you couldn't see was the other eye. Okay? Does that look like a face now? A skull? The place of the skull. Okay? Historically, makes all kinds of sense to me. Look at what's right in front of the place of the skull. A road. Historically, does that make sense? Yes. What did I just tell you about the advertisement? Where do you put a billboard? Next to the freeway. This was their freeway. Okay? All right. Just as a side note, I want to show you this. So this ledge is just above Golgotha, okay, Calvary, place of the skull. And it's interesting that as we traveled around Israel, there were many locations where if there was a biblical, historical event that happened in a specific location, this would be one of them, that Islam would have something on top of it. Think about the temple. What is on top of the second temple? The Dome of the Rock, built by who? Islam. Okay? And so this is a side note to everything. But here's how it was presented to us when we were there that day, is that when God has something going on, who tries to cover it up? Satan. Okay? This good versus evil, we sometimes water it down and we want to make everything spiritual. You can't touch it, you can't feel it, you can't see it. Guess what? You can touch it, you can see it. Okay? And it was just interesting as we went through the country that it just happens many, many, many times. Satan wants to bury everything that God has done. And we've said this in the past, but how did they build? How do they build in Israel? They build on top. They continue to build on top. And so, as a kid, you'd play King of the Hill. Who was the king of the hill? Whoever was on top. What's going on here? Satan's trying to be on top. Okay? He's not going to be, but just anytime you can take the Bible and you can go to fact, either historical fact, or you can touch it and you can see it, that should encourage us in our faith, because we're right. How else can you say that? We're right. Okay? Stand strong because it's real. All right. That is a bit of a tangent. Couldn't help myself. Okay. So, verse 33, Golgotha, the place of the skull, Skull Hill, the place that looks like a skull. That makes sense now after seeing the pictures, right? All right. Verse 34. There they offered Jesus wine to drink mixed with gall, but after tasting it, he refused to drink it. They offer him wine to drink. It's like a vinegar. Gall or myrrh is a natural narcotic. Why would the Romans give a narcotic to somebody who was going to be crucified? Anybody got any ideas? It's interesting.
Does it wake him up? Does it wake him up?
No,
Ease the pain should.
what do Romans think about easing people's pain?
Yeah, they don't.
Okay, so then why did they do it?
Make them live longer.
Thank you. Make them live longer, right? Okay, this is not the same by any means, okay? When I had a gallbladder attack, I'm in the ER, and I am super annoyed with what's going on. I've had it. This thing is just killing me. And the doctor walked in, who I knew because he was a neighbor at a place that we had in Hackensack. And I said, you got to give me something for this. And he said, yeah, I'll give you some morphine. And I said, well, that stop the pain. And he said, no, but you won't care anymore. Okay, that's a little bit about what's going on here. It doesn't knock you out. It doesn't make you oblivious to what's going on. But this was only done because it helped the Roman soldiers. Why do I say that? They have to get whoever's getting crucified, they have to get them on the cross. Do you want to go on a cross knowing you're never coming down, knowing that you're about to get nailed to a piece of wood? Are you going to fight back? What do you have to lose? And in fact, if you're being at all selfish, or I would say smart, if I fight enough right here, what happens? They just kill me. And if you're, and just for you to make it to the cross, because people didn't always make it there. They would die from the scourging, okay? If the soldier was having an off day or had a particular reason to be upset a little bit, maybe put just a little bit more into it, and the person died, right? Okay. It made it easier to get the criminal on the wooden beam. And they wouldn't fight or struggle as much as the nails were being smashed through your bones and through your body. Go to Psalm 69:21. There are a lot of prophecies that are fulfilled in this whole process. And if you want to take a deep dive in your own mind about the providence of God and how he works terrible things out for his own good and his glory, again, this is a bit of a mind bender. And so, I lost my place. Psalm, what did I tell you? 69 what? 69:21. They put gall in my food and gave me vinegar for my thirst. Jesus didn't drink it. Why? Was Jesus going to fight him when they put him on the cross? No, that's not why he was there. He was there to get to the cross, not to stay off of it. If he wanted to stay off of it, he would have never been in front of that place to begin with, right? Okay. He was the willing sacrifice. It is so important for us to remember that. Jesus was never the victim. Jesus was always the victor. Okay? Go to verse 35 of Matthew 27. And when they had crucified him, they divided up his clothes by casting lots. Matthew doesn't give us detail of the crucifixion, just that it happened. Go back to Psalms 22. And we're going to be in this particular spot, in and out of here, for a couple of minutes. But for right now, I want you to go to Psalms 22 and verse 18, okay? They divided my clothes among them and cast lots for my garment. How did they know hundreds of years before that was going to work out? How did they know that as a Roman soldier, if you were put on the duty of crucifying someone, that one of your bonuses was to get the clothes of the person that you killed? The detail of God's providence as you step through history, which also should give you so much encouragement and strength and stability if you're in a tough time. God's providence works things out exactly as he wants it to work out. Even in this tiny little detail about dividing up the clothes of Jesus, okay?
Before you go farther, I have a question about, because some things you see or read or hear, it's just a crossbeam that's being carried, it's not the whole cross.
Yep, well, let's talk about that. Okay? The horizontal part there, called the patibulum, that's the horizontal beam. It would probably weigh between 75 and 125 pounds. It would be between 6 and 10 feet long and 6 inches wide. The vertical part, called the stipes, 10 to 12 feet long. They used spikes that were 4.5 to 7 inches long. And depending on who you read, some people would say that that whole thing together would be well over 300 pounds. And so when you think about what you see in the movies, did Jesus carry the whole cross? Probably not. Everything that I could read, it just looks to me like normally they would carry that horizontal beam, okay?
I watched Bear Grylls the other night in
Yep.
Israel. And they said the crossbeam was probably 400 pounds.
The whole thing.
The crossbeam.
Yeah, I would disagree with that, but Bear can think what he wants and I'll think what I want.
It was somebody
So,
telling him that. It was
yeah.
a guy.
Yeah, if you think about, I mean, anybody that's done any construction, if you took a piece of wood that was 6 inches wide and 6 feet long, could you pick it up? Sure, right? And they were probably using, they could have used cedar, they could have used pine, they could have used olive wood. But if you think about a piece of cedar, for example, that is that size, what would a cedar piece of wood weigh like that? It would be lighter, right? Okay. All right. So it's interesting, but again, I like that we are putting the physicality with the spiritual, with the historical as we walk through this. Okay? All right. The crucifixion started at 9 a.m. Jesus has been awake for at least 24 hours, right? He's been beat up, punched, smacked, flogged, whipped. His flesh has been ripped open. He hasn't eaten since the night before. He's probably extremely dehydrated now from carrying, from walking, from the beatings, from the blood coming out. He walks to his death voluntarily to the wooden beam. When he gets there, there would be two ways that you would put somebody on a cross. You would either have the beam laid down, the vertical beam laid down, and you would lay the person on their back. Again, what does Jesus' back look like right now? And then you would put the person's feet on the beam and you would lay their foot out extended like this, okay? So if you think about your foot being laid flat out on the top of that beam, and they would drive a nail through the top of your foot. Why? Because that's where the bones are, okay? The other way that they would do it is they would take your feet and they would set them beside the beam and they would run a spike through your ankles into the wood. And so the beam would be between your legs and feet. And let me just show you something quick. That's a piece of somebody's foot, okay? Going sideways probably.
Yeah, that's an ankle.
There's one more of it. Is that, wow, tough stuff. Yeah. Okay. Couple things that just caught me. little things. Does the cross look super tall there? Growing up in Sunday school, when I thought about the cross, I thought about Jesus up on a very tall cross, and the pictures are always like that, right? Of people looking up at him like he was really high off the ground. Probably not true. If the vertical part was 10 feet long, and if the cross was mobile, meaning that they put the victim on their back, they are nailed through their feet, their arms are outstretched, and they're nailed. This is going to be, what does it say? Jesus, he talks about his hands, right? Okay? Was he nailed through here? This is what you would think. He was nailed through here. If they had nailed him through this part of his hand, when you had to pull yourself up, you would pull your hand through the spike. Is that what the Romans want? No. So you were nailed through the bottom of your hand, through your wrist, right next to the artery without hitting the artery, because if they hit the artery, what happens? You die quicker. So they don't want that. What else is going on in this part of your physiology? How many nerves are in here?
A lot.
A lot. Tanner's over there shaking his head. A lot. Okay? How many nerves are in your feet? My son Weston had foot surgery. They had to re-break his arch to get it to set and put pins and screws in there. Weston, if you know him, is his pain tolerance normal?
No.
It is not normal. It is something else. Okay? He had a tough time with that. Like, I think, I don't know of any other thing that he would complain about. But that hurt is an understatement. Okay? So, they were very specific about how they did it. And when they nailed you in those spots, was there a lot of blood? No. Okay? Again, they don't want you to bleed out. Okay? All right. Back to the crucifixion. If you were nailed on the ground, on your back, and the cross was on top of the ground, what happens next? They have to stand the cross up and put you in a hole. Who's ever done fencing? What happens when you have that corner post and you want to put it in the hole? You stand or built a pole barn. You stand the log up, and then what happens? Boom! When that hits the bottom, and when you're hanging like this, what happens? Your nerves go bonkers, and they send a message to your brain. And what is it saying?
I can't stand this.
I can't stand this. This is terrible. This is the worst thing I've ever felt in my life. And that's just the beginning. Okay? When they would nail you to the cross, sometimes they would do it so that your arms would be draped over the top of the wooden beam, and they would tie you with ropes. And so it would be this awkward thing where you're pulled up here, okay? But when they did it to Christ, what did they do? They weren't that nice. They would nail you out here. We want to sometimes imagine that this happened with his arms stretched out tight. But what would happen is they would have you bend, and that horizontal beam is above your head. So that when you got overwhelmed with the pain in your feet, what would you do? You would slump down. And when you slump down, because your hands are above your head and you have elbow room to bend, what happens? You slump down farther. And when you're in this position, you can't breathe. And so when you can't breathe, what do? You have to push back up. But if you're nailed through your feet, what happens when you push on your feet? Your nerves go crazy again. And you push yourself back up, because pain or air, which one's it going to be? And it has to be air. Who's ever done leg squats? All right. A really good leg day, what happens? We tease about this, but what happens in a really good leg day? Tanner has very strong legs. They're the biggest part of his body. And when Tanner has a good leg day, Tanner doesn't feel good. Why? Because all the blood goes in your legs.
Cramps.
Thank you. And then the cramps start. What happens when you're dehydrated?
Cramps.
You cramp more. And then you get a Charlie horse. Right? If you guys want to try this at home just for fun, put yourself in like a quarter squat and set the timer for 2 minutes and see if you make it. What does that feel like after 2 days? Let's back up. What does it feel like after a half hour? The physicality breaks down pretty fast, doesn't it? Okay. Give me a second. I gotta find my spot again.
One of the things that I had read before is that drop in, when that happens, more than likely it dislocates both your shoulders.
Yes.
And
Yes.
so every time that you're pulling up against 2 dislocated shoulders.
Yes. You're exactly right. So that's actually the next step here, is that this goes into a little bit more detail about the breathing process, but the shoulders being popped out of joint, that's a real thing. Okay? And even just the hanging part of that, even if there isn't a boom where it pulls it out, is your joint going to come out after a while? Yeah. And then if you take fatigue and dehydration and beatings beforehand, what do you have to withstand that? To make that not happen? How do you pull that back in? If anybody's done pull-ups, even just to hang on a bar with your arms out like this, because I'm not 13 anymore, even to get started on that, sometimes you're like, okay, I gotta get that shoulder just right to make it work. And here you are, not ripping, but being hung from here. Okay? All right. Even if you notice the bottom part, that bend in there is important, and because you're under constant tension, and you're either got to push up or you got to slump down. But there is not a good place. There's not a good place to rest. Okay. All right. In the Gospel of John, we read about doubting Thomas, right? And what does doubting Thomas say? I won't believe until I see your hands. Did the Bible make a mistake when they said that? Well, is this in your hand? Well, we would say, no, that's your wrist, okay? But in the Greek, hand means anything from the tip of your finger to your elbow, okay? Just so you know, the Bible's still true and real and accurate, okay? If the cross was laid on the ground, they would be tipped up and they would be slammed into the hole. And then, just like Tanner said, your shoulders come out of socket and this pain just sears all over your body. If Jesus was hoisted up and the cross was more permanent right there on the place called the skull, Golgotha, and as I think through that, it seems to me that that's probably the case. That cross was there permanently, the vertical part, and so Jesus would back up to the vertical part, and they would hoist him up into position, and then that cross member is put together with the vertical member. What happens if your back is pure exposed muscle and tissue, and you get on that? What happens when you go up that cross?
Splinters.
It's ripped open again.
Yeah, it wasn't plain wood.
And it wasn't plain, it was rough. And anybody that's ever had a little piece of wood stuck under their fingernail or something like that, now do that by 100 times, 1,000 times, as you would take that trip up the back of the vertical piece of the cross. Is any of this fun? No. This was the worst way you could ever die. Okay? On top of that, as you're being pulled up into position, where's the rest of your body? Hanging from where? Your wrist. And then what happens once you get up position? Once you get up in that position, you're hanging, and then they nail your feet. Okay? It's terrible. Now that Jesus is nailed to the cross, the real horror of the crucifixion actually begins. And that part alone, it's crazy. The worst hasn't even come yet. Because we've kind of talked about this, because of the physical positioning, because your points of contact are painful and your nerves are there, you have to move to breathe. Okay? You don't have a choice. And that's the worst part, because you're always just this close to asphyxiation, right? And then you get cramping in your chest, and it isn't that you can't take air in, it's that you can't get it out. And so you have to push back up to release that. And if you've ever held your breath as long as you can, at some point you just take in more air. No, you have to get it out. Okay? Many factors contributed to Jesus' death. A combination of shock and asphyxiation is what would normally kill people that were on the cross. But in Jesus' case, this is Rick theology, okay? In Jesus' case, I'm going to suggest to you that he died of a heart attack. And part of that, from the story, how do they go back and check Jesus? And they're like, okay, the Jews want these guys off the cross. Why? Because they want to have Passover, okay? And so they have to get him off the cross before Passover kicks in. And so they're under a time constraint. Normally, people would be on the cross for a long time, many, many hours to a couple of days. But they got to hurry this thing up, okay? And so when they get to Jesus, what do? They check him. He seems dead. But does Rome ever mess up a crucifixion? Does anybody ever come back down off the cross to tell about it? Absolutely no. And again, look at how God uses unbelievers in his own providence to absolutely prove with fact that Jesus died. People say, no, I think Jesus got off the cross, he left town for a few days, recovered, and then he walked back in to meet his disciples. How do we know that that absolutely was not true? One, because God used people who didn't believe in him to prove that he died. Romans don't mess this up. They're perfect at it, okay? And so when they check Jesus and they believe he's dead, how do they make sure he's dead? They put a spear in his side, between his ribs, probably on the right side, and where does that spear go?
Heart.
Into the heart. And it says that what came out? Water and blood. And so, I'm going to get the terms wrong, but the pericardium and the water around your heart, when you have that type of a death, water goes around that area, right? And out it came. So even if Jesus had died from the flogging, if he hadn't died from being on the cross, would he die from the spear? Yes, except that he was already dead. Okay? Again, how do we know for sure that he was dead? Because what happened to the two thieves?
They broke their ring.
Why did they break their legs?
So they couldn't push up.
And what happens when you can't push up? You die, right? Okay. It sounds kind of sterile when they say, well, they just broke their legs. They would use a large wooden mallet. And the word shouldn't say broken, it should say smashed. They smashed the bones in the leg so that there was no way that you were going to push on it. If your bone is smashed into pieces, instead of being this nice, clean fracture. Do people walk around with fractures in their legs? Sometimes they do. Do people walk around when the bone is disintegrated? Never. This is tough stuff. But look at how many times God proves that his plan happened. And here's another little tiny bit. If he had been alive, he would have had his bones broken too. Okay? All right. We got to back up just a little bit. And if we go to, this is probably where we'll end, verse 35. And when they had crucified him, they divided up his clothes by casting lots. The Jewish garb would have included shoes, head coverings, a belt, an inner garment, and an outer garment. How many pieces was that? 5. Okay? I'm going to suggest that there was 4 soldiers guarding Jesus on the cross. What was their purpose? Their purpose was to make sure that nobody came to help, nobody interfered, nobody changed the plan until Jesus was dead. And I already told you that it was normal for those soldiers to divvy up the clothes as a bonus. And a long time ago, we talked about one of the stores of wealth in that culture was your garments, okay? So it was a form of payment in this case. And because possibly, I mean, this is not, no one's going to lose their mind theologically over this, but if there was 4 soldiers there, what are you going to do with the 5th piece? You're going to either chop it up, or if you don't want to wreck it, what do? You decide to divide the clothing, the 5 pieces up, and you throw lots or dice or whatever to see who gets the extra one. Okay? All right. Again, the point of taking the very last physical articles of wealth that anybody had and dividing them up with the soldiers who are there to make sure you don't come off the cross is another form of humiliation in front of everybody. Okay? All right. Let's just do verse 36, and this will be really fast. But in verse 36, and sitting down, they kept watch over him there. They sit down and they wait for Jesus to die. In their mind, who cares? It's just another thief. It's just another criminal. It's just another bad person. It's just another batch of misfits who are getting what they deserve. And that's what they thought. Yet, God's plan, his providence, was being handled, was being fulfilled exactly as it was supposed to be. Next week, we'll get out of this. We'll get into some things that are a little more uplifting, but I hope there's little nuggets in that you will remember as we go forward with our lives. When we think or say, Jesus died on the cross for me, I want us to have a picture that means more, that feels more, that's more intimate, that's real, that's a historical fact. We need to lock that in, okay? All right, you guys are dismissed.
Why do you think they put his clothes back on him if they were going to take them and try to resell them or use them for personal wealth? Because they would have gotten all bloody and...
Yeah, and it's interesting. And so 2 things. One, historically, it wasn't uncommon from the point that the flogging was done to have that victim or person walk naked through the streets out of town to the cross. That was not uncommon. The Bible says that they put his clothes back on him, and the only thing that I could say about that is that, again, when it took time for Jesus to walk out of the gate into Golgotha, okay?
So just to rip them off.
Is to rip them back off again. It's just more humiliation, it's more torture, it's more extension of pain, and it's all terrible, and yet it was the Father's plan. Crazy. And I'll try and get you some more pictures next week, because the proximity of all of this is wild. How close everything is together. Okay?